Well, welcome to day 2, part 2. Talking about for whom the bell tolls. The bell's now tolling in the Customs House. This is yet another one of my favourite buildings along the Bund. It was built at around about 1925 to 1928 by Palmer and Turner Associates, but this time not by George Wilson but by his associate Bothwell. It's a significant building because it's been on the same site in its history since any customs house was in Shanghai. And there's a long story about customs in Shanghai in any case that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. The duty that came through the customs house, through all of the shipping and the imports, did generate significant income for China, in particular to pay off the war reparations from the Second Opium War to Britain and France. By the mid-1860s, Emperor Dowager Cixi, who had in essence effected a coup by then and was the de facto ruler of China, appointed an Irishman in charge of the customs house. He was there for 50 years, so he did a good job. It was an incredibly courageous and risky move. She put him there to stamp out corruption. And within 2 years of him being there, customs duties were generating something like 32 million taels of silver. Back to the building, you cannot see from here perhaps, but you have to clearly walk down to the front doors, which are in beautiful bronze, down to the front doors, so there's likely been significant subsidence there. Got 4 beautiful Doric columns that lead the eye up to more sort of ersatz columns that lead up to the frieze. It's a restrained classical form, and if you take your eye even further up, you can see that their style changes somewhat, and at the highest point above the clock tower itself, it becomes Art Deco. It's possible that George Willis sort of took over the design of the building because the clock tower was built last, or designed last. The clock tower itself is incredibly heavy. I can't remember how heavy right now, but so heavy that the central part of the underlying concrete foundation had to be much, much thicker than the marginal parts. And there was some concern that that clock tower would actually break the building into 2 pieces, which is a good segue into the next building, which is the biggest and most expensive, certainly at the time, building along the Bund, which is the HSBC, or the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. And the older among you might remember HSBC as the consumer of Midland Bank in Britain. Anyway, it has a sort of neo-Greek or high English Renaissance style that is also Beaux-Arts in various places. Remember, at this time, at the beginning of the 20th century, Beaux-Arts was an amalgam of all sorts of styles, and it was very, very ornate and simply too much. It had essentially gone out of fashion in Europe, but in Asia, in Shanghai, it was still okay. And in particular in Shanghai and along the Bund, this became a common style of architecture, and that is principally because, of course, these institutions, these buildings, are mostly banks and insurance companies, and those clients dictate to the architects what style they want. Those are conservative institutions, conservative clients for the most part, and so to befit the role of the building or the institution, the architecture itself had to be conservative. So that's what you mostly find along here. This building was a challenge in particular. It was built, by the way, or designed by Palmer and Turner, and this time by George Willis. It was a challenge, an engineering challenge, because this building contained most of the silver that came into Shanghai through banking and imports. At the back of the building, which is about 300 meters long, there is a massive vault that contained various amounts of silver as it came in and went out. The dome itself is a hugely incredible and heavy dome that took an extra reinforced concrete foundation, and there was legitimate concern at the time that the dome would break the building in two. So two buildings next to each other that were at risk of breaking in the middle because of their heavy middle structure. Underneath the dome, the atrium is octagonal, which is very appropriate for China because 8 is the lucky number. So it's a lovely example of a blend of Chinese feng shui, if you like, and English architectural qualities brought to the Bund. Let's go on to the next building. Now then, continuing our quick tour, this is the old Great Northern Territory Corporation building, and I've been using this this architectural term, Beaux-Arts, perhaps a little too casually down here. Most of these buildings are formerly English Classical Renaissance. This one, of all of them, is explicitly French Late Renaissance, which translates straight to Beaux-Arts. And if you are a student of architecture, you can immediately see this in the difference in the tops of the windows, the ornate capitals, the Baroque twin towers that cap the building. All of that ensemble is essentially Beaux-Arts. Maybe you can begin to see why it went out of style. It was designed by Atkinson and Dallas, and it was built in the year of the Great San Francisco earthquake, 1906, 1907. It's made of brick and concrete, and it's relatively hideous. Something more different, I think very different and almost unique along the Bund, is this wonderful Gothic revival building. That, although it looks sort of Disney-esque because we've been spoiled nowadays, is a bus. But it's also the oldest building along the Bund. This is 1897. It was designed by Morrison, Grattan and Scott. It was the first commercial bank of China, then called the Imperial Bank of China. It's masonry. It seems to suggest that it's subsided, looking at the sort of the dimensions of the capitals, but we're not sure about that yet. In any case, it is perhaps, along with the Peace Hotel, which is farther north and we covered earlier, it is the most unique building along the Bund. It stands out. I suppose you could include the Art Deco building too. Right, let's move toward the end. Right, the next building along our quick tour of the Bund is the Union Insurance Building, which sits on Guangdong Lu, which is the one that crosses perpendicular to the Bund itself. And in the day, this was the official southern end of the Bund. It's not now, obviously. This was designed by none other than Palmer and Turner Associates and by George Willis. And uniquely among the buildings along the Bund, and in Shanghai at the time, it was the first office building to use a steel frame. And it contained some of the largest open office space because it could use a steel frame. The style is English Classical Renaissance. Aside from that, there's nothing particularly interesting about it. So this is the penultimate building along our quick tour of the Bund. It is the most difficult one of all along the Bund and in Shanghai in general because it is the Shanghai Club, and it represents everything that Shanghaiese and perhaps even the British don't particularly want to remember about this time in Shanghai's history. It is what was the most sumptuous, the most ostentatious club in Asia at the time. You can tell from the 6 Corinthian columns at the front that this is a structure that is supporting a very large and, I can tell you, sumptuous interior. We can't get into it, but by all accounts, it is dripping with ostentatiousness. It is a classical style building, although you can see that there are, again, these ostentatious touches to it, which are essentially Beaux-Arts, this sort of festooned floral drapery stuff that's over the sort of faux keystone over the windows. As I said, the Corinthian capitals. You can also see very plainly, especially when these cars get out of the way, that to get into the building you have to walk down a significant number of steps. This was one of the earliest buildings built along the Bund, and subsidence was not engineered properly for, and so the building did sink a few meters. The principal source, reference source for our information about many of these buildings is a book by Denison and Wren called Building Shanghai. And quoting from Denison and Wren, the building's sober exterior, I'm not sure I would call it sober, the building's sober exterior belied the intoxicated constitution of the members inside. And those members forbade both women and Chinese unless they were serving the members inside. So more reason still to have this building somewhat in the shadows. And now, irony of ironies, what used to be the bastion of the British elite, the Shanghai Club, is now what else? It is the Waldorf Astoria. Nonetheless, it is iconic of its time, and we can't rewrite history that much. Well, we come to the end of this very quick tour of the buildings along the Bund. This is number one, the Bund. This is the McBain building. And McBain was an interesting fellow. He was, by all accounts, a self-made businessman from England who came and started a trading company in Shanghai in 1879. The building itself is not overly interesting. It's a relatively simple Renaissance style building. You can see even from here that it has suffered significant subsidence. You have to walk down again to the front door from the sidewalk or the pavement. But the most significant part of the building, which was important to McBain, is that it's taller than its neighbour, the Shanghai Club. It was designed by Robert Moorhead and supervised by Swiss engineer Emile Luthi. Now, it's number one, the Bund, in partly because at the time, at this location, where I am now, I'm looking down what becomes Yan'an Highway, or elevated highway. And this is a site of an old creek. I say creek, small river. It's big enough to effectively provide some defense to the international settlement, which is everything behind me at the time. So in front of me is essentially the old part of Shanghai, the old city, and the Chinese part. Behind me is the international settlement. And this became the first line of defense. And it bounded the southern part of the international settlement. That goes on all the way to the next major creek that would cut up to Suzhou Creek. And that sort of square area formed the boundaries of the then international settlement. And it's to those boundaries that in the 1850s and early 1860s that the Taiping rebels of the infamous Taiping Rebellion reached. That's how close they got to coming into Shanghai. Shanghai may have been very different. Indeed, China's entire history may have been very different if the Taiping Rebellion had moved into Shanghai itself, but it didn't. And we are where we are today. So there are lovely buildings south of me and behind the camera on this side of the Bund, which we'll talk about another time. But these, at least, have been some of the highlights of buildings built in the early 1900s by some of the most prominent architects representing the money in old Shanghai. So, see you later. Don't forget to like and subscribe